And in all of this, the really shocking truth was that the switching of the focus from capturing bin Laden and the need to capture bin Laden to chasing Saddam. Remember John Walker Lind. Americans first heard of him in 2002 as the treacherous, California-reared face of the Taliban, who'd had a hand in the murder of a CIA agent in the north of Afghanistan. But months later, when the case got to court, the only charge that the young man had carried a gun for the Taliban. Remember the arrest of the dirty bomber in Chicago. Then US Attorney General John Ashcroft had Americans cowering with a live-cross news feed from Moscow, in which he left us believing that a radioactive attack had been imminent. A detailed case is still to get to court in the US, but it seems that Ashcroft exaggerated wildly. Mohammed Atta. He was the 9/11 ringleader who secretly met with Iraqi agents in Prague. Now, Atta was the man who did pilot a plane into the World Trade Center in New York City. But he was never in Prague, cutting deals with Saddam. And all the anthrax. The only leads the US investigators have come up with are homegrown, not Taliban, not Al-Qaeda. More recently, Bush vowed to prevent Al-Qaeda and other foreign terrorists from turning Iraq into what Afghanistan was under the Taliban. But it's too late. The CIA and the UN have already assessed Iraq after the US-led invasion to be even more effective as an Islamic terrorist training center than Afghanistan ever was. They're busing would-be and trainee terrorists in from Afghanistan now for training. And Osama bin Laden is still at large. This sense of unreality continues. After his absurd mission accomplished claim in 2003, George Bush handed America's highest civil honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, to some of the key wrongdoers on his side. To CIA Director George Tenet, who assured the White House that the WMD case for war against Iraq was a slam dunk. To Paul Bremer, his Baghdad proconsul, who made the most short-sighted decisions of the occupation, disbanding the Iraq military and marginalizing all Baathists. And to Tommy Franks, the general whose failed military planning for the occupation spawned an insurgency that has killed close to 2,000 young Americans and 10 or more times that many Iraqis. There was little fuss when those who did have the courage to speak out before going to war were punished, and hardly the batting of an eyelid when they were later proved correct. US Army Secretary Thomas White and General Eric Shinseki were bundled out of their jobs for pre-invasion claims that planned troop numbers were insufficient to effectively occupy Iraq. Ditto Larry Lindsey, director of the US National Economic Council, who told the Wall Street Journal that the war could cost up to $200 billion. Last month, Congress had approved $204 billion. And furious that the International Atomic Energy Agency had found no weapons in Iraq, because there were none, Washington launched a determined campaign to roll Mohammed al-Baradei as the agency's chief, hoping to replace him with one Alexander Downer. None of this made sense till about a year ago, when an American journalist, Ron Suskind, writing in the New York Times magazine, was able to reveal the inverted reality of the Bush White House. His, and ultimately our, moment of enlightenment came as he was being admonished by a senior presidential aide for his, that's Suskind's, failure to understand the functioning of presidential power post 9/11. Suskind writes, "The aide said that guys like me were in what we call a reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. But, the aide told him, that's not the way the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too, and that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, the aide said, and you, all of you, will be left just to study what we do. The Americans should have stopped in Afghanistan. Toppling the Taliban and putting bin Laden on the run was a low-cost, high-yield intervention unchallenged anywhere in the world as a perfectly legitimate response to ferocious and unforgivable attacks on New York and Washington. And even though it was not in the Middle East, it set the scene for what still could be Bush's democracy beacon in the Islamic world. It's still very shaky, precisely because the Americans did rush off to start another war. If only a half of the funds that have been thrown into the Baghdad black hole had been devoted to Afghanistan, and only half of the military commitment, Afghans and the world might be rallying today around and in a fledgling democracy with more sustained hope for the future than the prospective narco-state that Afghanistan is today. In much the same way that the Americans allowed the looting of Baghdad to reduce a normally well-behaved and law-abiding society to lawlessness and their country to a criminal wasteland in a matter of days, the Americans have stood by and allowed the old warlord, tribal and religious leaders of Afghanistan to manipulate a supposedly democratic electoral process to deliver power to themselves. The release of election results in the coming days will be a measure of their success. But globally, the world is moving on from Afghanistan because, as in Iraq, Bush already has declared it a democratic success. There are signs of hope in Kabul. The security crisis is nothing like that in Iraq. And it's a joy to see young girls skipping off to school every morning. As I walked into the office an office in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a group of excited young men is gathered around a poster advertising Fulbright fellowships. But there are daily signs of underlying problems that could well be insurmountable in the absence of a more determined world aid effort. As we waited for our appointment at the Foreign Ministry, a young Afghani tells me excitedly of his role in the previous days as an intermediary between some of the country's most senior policemen and some of its roughest drug barons, as a deal was hammered out to buy back 28 kilos of confiscated heroin. The turning point for that deal was the purity of the heroin and the argument that no would-be buyer would ever believe the policeman if they said it was pure, but they would believe the drug dealer. The previous day, the man who headed the Taliban's cruel security apparatus had eyeballed me, insisting that there was nothing for which he needed to apologize to the people of Afghanistan. Despite a clearly stated yearning for a process of national reconciliation, the president's brother and another suspected drug dealer, Wali Karzai, argued to me that Afghanistan just had to forget the past. And in his austere chamber in Kabul, Chief Justice Faisal Haidi Shinwari explained in all seriousness that the requirement for 4 eyewitnesses to prove a rape charge, which is virtually impossible, was in the law to save women the embarrassment of having the whole community know they had been raped. It doesn't matter that bin Laden is still at large, or that US aid officials in Kabul are wringing their hands in desperation because they don't have the funds to seriously tackle drugs and other problems. Last month, when one of these aides complained to me that just a few $1 billion would kickstart the Alternative Livelihoods Program, which is essential to weaning Afghan farmers off the opium crop, I was taken aback by his anger and frustration. "Why don't you just nick it from the $87 billion going into Iraq?" I asked, mostly in jest. He snorted through clenched teeth and looked at me and said, "Don't get me started." Sorry. It's a very small platform. But the Americans knew what they were doing. Straight off to Iraq, where Saddam, his bureaucracy, and military literally walked away from their posts. There was hardly a conquest. As looters ran amok, US proconsul Paul Bremer created 500,000 new enemies for Washington, with his twin decisions to disband the military and to outlaw anyone who'd been a Ba'athist, which meant much of the professional and managerial classes who previously had kept the country running were now sidelined, stewing and bent on revenge. Just as the extended family of every Iraqi killed in the crisis is culturally programmed to seek vengeance. The elephant on the Baghdad table was the huge Shiite majority that had been oppressed for centuries. But Americans are not necessarily good elephant trainers. They wanted to work around the Shia religious leadership, hoping that they could buy time for the exiles they brought back by the plane load to build their own political parties and constituencies. But as Mark Danner observed quite perceptively in the New York Times last month, the Americans never managed to confront Iraq's underlying political dysfunction, of which the tyranny of Saddam Hussein was a product, not the cause. Ditto the insurgency itself. For all the talk of foreign fighters, few of them would survive for more than a day in Iraq without the support of locals. Worst of all, strategically, the conflict in Iraq has revealed not so much the extent of US power as its limits. Apart from repeated military setbacks in an environment in which the insurgency doesn't have to win, it merely doesn't have to lose, Iraqis and the whole Arab world watch with as much fear as amazement as the greatest superpower battles to achieve even the levels of power and oil production managed by a sanctions-shackled Saddam in the months before the invasion. The neocons and their acolytes are fond of charging that people don't get it, but Bush clearly didn't get one of the paradoxes of American power as articulated by Harvard's Joseph Nye, and that is that the US is too great to be challenged by any other state in this world, but not great enough to act alone in solving problems as great as global terrorism and nuclear proliferation. Having made its call to go into Iraq, the US is stuck there for the foreseeable future. Any attempt to sneak out with more dodgy claims of mission accomplished will be revealed so quickly that the damage to US credibility and prestige could be catastrophic. It's no exaggeration to say that there's a risk the entire region could implode, possibly delivering to Al-Qaeda or one of its satellites a state-based operation in Iraq or maybe even in Saudi Arabia that would threaten global oil supplies and the delicate balance of power in the region. It can't be allowed to happen. So at what cost, at what price might Iraq be rescued from the Americans? The short answer is probably not the way the Americans are going about it. When Donald Rumsfeld first spoke of an Iraqi tipping point, the Defense Secretary was referring to the imminent collapse of Saddam's military in the face of the US-led invasion. Today, his term is being applied to the Americans themselves, and that tipping point is the intersecting graphs of US tolerance for death and dollars in Iraq, and a dawning reality that unless Washington orders a new military draft, there simply won't be enough US soldiers to maintain the numbers in Iraq by early next year.